Hello folks, welcome back to after Easter, the first lesson post the holiday. I know it doesn't really feel like we've had a holiday because life is all very confusing, but let's start on page 12 of the module because that is our kind of framework and it helps remind us where we are and where we're going and everything. So page 12, we are working through 17 different factors as to why levels of development in sub-Saharan Africa might not be very high. We were partway through the political column before the Easter holidays, and today we're going to talk about governance and corruption. So we may get that column finished in this video. It might slightly go into tomorrow's video, but we're on governance and corruption. And the actual part of the module that talks about those categories begins on page 39. Right, so page 39. Right, governance is about how the governments in sub-Saharan Africa run their countries. And before we go any further, we need to talk about two D words. And they're both written at the top of page 39. And they're really, really important for this part of the module. The two D words are democracy and dictatorship. Now, democracy, you've got a dictionary definition and I'll just try and talk you through that really. Democracy is what we have in the UK. The idea is that when we have various elections, we vote for who we think we want to run the country, and then one of the parties wins and they run the country. So there is a voting system. It's often referred to as the rule of the majority, and we choose who runs the country. Now, whatever you think about the British government at the moment, whatever you think about various things, democracy is widely regarded to be a good thing, all right? The opposite is dictatorship. So a dictatorship is where one person makes all the rules and decisions. Now, it could be possible, and I want to really emphasise that you could have a really amazing person in charge of a country who ran it wonderfully and perfectly and it was all great, but that pretty much never happens as far as I'm aware. The people who become dictators generally are very selfish people, and they don't run the country for the good of the country, they run the country for the good of themselves. And that's why governance and corruption, unfortunately, particularly in the context of sub-Saharan Africa, it makes sense to talk about them at the same time. All right, so democracy good, dictatorship bad. And what the rest of pages 39 and 40 talk you through is the fact that democracy is increasing in sub-Saharan Africa, which is brilliant, but it's certainly not yet the norm. And even when you do have democratic elections, there's quite a lot of suggestion that they're not perhaps run as fairly and properly as they should be. So that's where we begin to drift from governance into corruption towards the end of this, okay? So I'm not going to insult your intelligence by reading pages 39 and 40 to you because it's got all sorts of points in it. It's just the idea that essentially a lot of governments in sub-Saharan Africa are not particularly good for the countries that they control. Okay, that leads us to think about this in more detail. So we're trying to understand why levels of development in sub-Saharan Africa might not be particularly good. Well, on the screen in front of you, it just points you in a few directions about why governance is important. It pretty much affects everything. You know, if you go back to the definition of development, and I will give you a page reference for that, page 5. Development is the progressive improvement in the standard of living and quality of life for an increasing proportion of the population. Well, if you really think about that, the organisation that perhaps has the most direct impact on that is the government of the country you live in. How do they invest the money? Do they build schools and hospitals and roads and sewer networks and infrastructure, or do they take as much of the profit as they possibly can? Do they prioritise military things over other things? Is there effective use of money? Is there effective use of resources? If you've got a really good government who don't seem to be involved in corruption, etc., that could be a reason that multinational companies might think about investing in you. This is a previous lesson. And we said that traditionally multinational companies have avoided sub-Saharan Africa because it's just too difficult and too problematic. And governance would have a direct impact on that. Are they good at building trade relationships or whatever? So governance, as you can see, I'm probably quite biased. I sort of feel that governance has a huge impact on levels of development, but I will put forward both sides, obviously, of the argument for you. Now, of our 5 countries that we are choosing to focus on, I am going to suggest that for this we focus on Botswana and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, because they are within an African context, which is what this module is all about. They are at opposite ends of the scale. So this PowerPoint is in the folder that I've shared with you, which is called just Africa, and the PowerPoint is called Governance. So you can open these hyperlinks, but what you can see is that Botswana is colour-coded green. Don't get too worried about what all the scores mean, but it's good. It's classed as free. They're widely regarded to be a really excellent government, definitely democracy, really pretty good. Okay, and this is just a screenshot from the BBC. Botswana, one of Africa's most stable countries, is the continent's longest continuous multi-party democracy. Now what that means is it's just like the UK. There are various political parties, so we've got the Conservatives and Labour and the Lib Dems, etc. And we vote as to who's in charge at any particular time. So they have a system that's quite like the UK. It's relatively free of corruption and has a good human rights record. Pretty good stuff. A more up-to-date example, also quite a lot of parallels with the UK. If you join a union when you're employed, what it means is that you are kind of protected. So if you've got any disputes about wages or things like that, rather than you just complaining on your own, you've got the weight of the union behind you. And I'm sure you noticed that a number of teachers were going on strike because of threats to sixth form colleges in this academic year. Well, as you can see, a few years ago, public sector workers in Botswana went on a strike. They started it on the 18th of April. It came to an end 9 weeks later. They were asking for a wage increase of 16%. The government offered 0%. After the strike, the government's offer was 3%. Now, don't get me wrong, 3% is not 16%, but if they hadn't have gone on strike, they probably wouldn't have got that 3%. These people were not, they didn't have tear gas thrown at them, they weren't tortured, they weren't put in prison, they were allowed to protest, and it's just, as far as I can tell, having never visited Botswana, the country's run in a really similar way to the way that the UK is run. All right, it's not perfect, but within an African context, things go along pretty well. Our other 3 countries are somewhere in the middle. They're all yet colour-coded yellow. It's like, it's not great, but it's not a complete disaster. So I thought it would make sense for us to have as our comparison the DRC, where it's pretty much as bad as it can possibly get, really. And I know that's a slightly depressing thing to say, but there we are, that's the truth. So, what I thought I'd do is go into a little bit of detail with you about what's happened in DRC. Some of you might be quite interested in this. I think this is fascinating, I really do, and you might want to go off and do a bit more research, but I'll try and point you in the right direction. Okay, so DR Congo was a Belgian colony back in the scramble for Africa that we've talked about in a previous video. So it was maintained by the Belgians, and then, like all of the others, eventually it got independence. Okay, so this is the first important part. Patrice Lumumba was democratically, can I just remind you that that's a really good thing, the people voted Patrice Lumumba in to be the first Prime Minister of DR Congo upon independence. Now, the second bullet point tells you he was determined for DR Congo to become independent. He was very pro-African. Pan-Africanist means he wanted Africa to work together. He didn't want Africa to be reliant on the West anymore. He wanted African countries to help each other out, okay? So in many ways, he was not unique, but quite different. Then there was a mutiny. Now remember, we've talked about this before. During the scramble for Africa, the way that many of the colonial powers kept power was something called divide and conquer. So you'd have different groups of people who, to all intents and purposes, hated each other. So this is not unusual to have conflict after independence. So there's a mutiny, but it's in his own army, which is a bit of a nightmare. Lumumba appealed to the USA and the United Nations for help, and they refused. So what he then did is he turned to the Soviet Union. Now, this is the Cold War times. This is when the Western world is quite worried about communism, etc., etc. They did not like this, okay? They were really unhappy with Lumumba turning to the Soviet Union. And so he was imprisoned. The Belgians, who used to be the colonial rulers of DRC, the Belgians put a man called Mobutu in charge of DR Congo, and Lumumba was then executed by a firing squad. Okay, so we've got a Prime Minister who was very pro-Africa, African countries working together, African countries helping each other out, voted in by the people. He gets executed by a president, well, the man who went on to become president, President Mobutu, who was made president by the Belgians. And the reason that the Belgians liked Mobutu is he had already agreed that he was very pro-Western. He wanted to keep trading with Belgium and Europe and America. The Western world loved that. So it would appear, although Patrice Lumumba was assassinated because he was too pro-African. They didn't want to lose their ties with the DRC. All right, so now we have a lovely, lovely man called President Mobutu in charge. He was in charge for 32 years. He was a dictator. And we'll come back to Kabila in a minute. This is President Mobutu. He basically stole billions and billions from the DRC's wealth. He built himself various palaces. He had a runway built in DR Congo where Concorde could land. There were hardly any runways in the world that Concorde could land. He just had this lavish lifestyle that was completely paid for by the DRC. Okay. It's estimated, as you can see in front of you, that he took about $15 billion. So this is all money that could have been improving the quality of life for ordinary people in the country, but actually was being spent on clothes and airports and palaces, etc. for himself. So kleptocracy, which is a cool word, was actually a word that came into being because of Mobutu and the way he ran that country. It's a form of governance where corruption is just everywhere. If you can use the word kleptocracy, that's quite a cool word. So Mobutu is just, unfortunately, the perfect example of badly running a country under a dictatorship, running a country that will have the opposite impact on development. It unfortunately ticks all the boxes for that. Okay, and then in the next video, I'm going to pick up on what happened after Mobutu, so with Laurent Kabila in 1997. All right, so I will see you in the next video very shortly.